Zinc is a nutrient that's necessary for immune function, wound healing, growth and reproduction, and the activity of hundreds of enzymes. It's important for cell signaling and cell division, building proteins and DNA. Recommended intakes, you can see only 3 milligrams for toddlers, 5 for older children, 8 for 9 to 13-year-olds, 9 for teens, females, 11 for males 14 years of age and over, 11 for pregnancy, 12 for lactation. And sorry, that 8 was for 9 to 13-year-olds plus adult women, 19 years of age and older. And needs can be up to 50% higher in those eating high fiber, high phytate plant-based diets. There are homeostatic mechanisms that appear to help people adjust to lower intakes over time, which means that it helps people to absorb more. So this can certainly can occur. Now, if we look at actual zinc intakes, it's not quite the same as iron. What we see is non-vegetarians tend to have the highest at around 11 or 12 milligrams. Lacto-ovo-vegetarians around 10 to 12. And vegans, generally around 11, although Epic Oxford was a little lower. What about in toddlers and youth? Well, it was interesting. They were all pretty close. Omnivores at about 5 milligrams per day, lacto-ovo-vegetarians just below 5, and vegans at about 5 milligrams per day. They were all fairly low, to be honest. So zinc deficiency, what we see with moderate zinc deficiency is impaired immune function, loss of appetite, hair loss, diarrhea, and with more severe deficiencies, stunted growth in children, delayed sexual maturation, impotence, hypogonadism, eye and skin lesions. So it's fairly serious stuff. We need to pay attention to zinc, especially during the growing years. Factors that increase risk are inadequate intakes and poor zinc absorption. And we see inadequate intakes in poor quality diets. So again, highly processed or junk food diets that don't have a lot of variety. We see it in kids that are picky eaters. We see it with late introduction to solid foods, and we see it in adults and teens who are consuming excess alcohol. We see it with insufficient calories, restrictive diets, poverty, eating disorders, and illnesses as well. And then in terms of poor zinc absorption, a high phytate diet, an emphasis on high phytate foods like wheat bran and unleavened breads, a failure to employ techniques that reduce phytates like soaking, sprouting, fermenting, leavening, and of course, we see it with reduced absorption ability. People that have gastrointestinal diseases or malabsorption syndromes, liver disease, renal disease, diabetes, cancer can have a reduced absorption ability. So how do we boost zinc? Well, we want to include zinc-rich foods at each meal. We want to limit the use of very high phytate foods like wheat bran, use food preparation techniques that reduce phytates, and ensure sufficient calories, including regular nutritious snacks for small children especially. So what foods contain zinc? Well, foods that contain at least 2 milligrams per serving are in red. Things like adzuki beans and tofu, pumpkin seeds, chia seeds, oatmeal, and you can see that compared to the amount in beef at 3.5. And then foods that are in purple, like the cashews and the wheat sprouts and kamut, are somewhere between 1.5 and 2. And then we get some zinc from other legumes, other nuts and seeds, a little bit from fruits and vegetables as well, but not so much. Avocados being a little bit of an exception at 1.3 for a medium-sized avocado. Zinc supplements, are they needed? Well, too much zinc can impair copper and iron status, reduce immune function, cause nausea, vomiting, stomach pain, and headaches. And the upper limit for zinc for adults is like 45 milligrams, so it's not very high. Single nutrient supplements are just not advised unless they're medically indicated, which means you've got a zinc deficiency that's been identified. Most multivitamin mineral supplements can provide safe levels of zinc and can provide a boost for those with low intakes, and actually can be of value for children. Moving on to calcium, the big question we often get asked where calcium is concerned is, isn't cow's milk necessary? And the answer is no, it's not necessary. Every mammal produces a milk that's designed specifically for their offspring. No species requires the milk of another species for their survival. In fact, in my opinion, it would defy rationality to assume that any animal would require the milk of another animal for its survival. It just doesn't make sense. If we look at pre-agricultural populations, humans average 1,000 to 1,500 milligrams of calcium per day without a single drop of cow's milk. Where did they get it? They got it mainly from plants. Calcium-rich plant foods offer impressive advantages over dairy. It's low in saturated fat, cholesterol-free. They're rich sources of fiber and antioxidants and phytochemicals and vitamin C, K, and folate, magnesium, potassium, boron. And so, plant foods can be a really wonderful sources of calcium if you're choosing correctly. So how much do we need? Well, the recommended dietary allowance, or the RDA, is actually quite high in North America. It's a little lower in a lot of the European countries, but it's 700 milligrams a day for 1 to 3 year olds, 1,000 for 4 to 8 year olds, and 1,300 for 9 to 18 year olds. It's 1,000 for adults, for females 9 to 50, and for males 19 to 50, and for males 19 to 70. And it's 1,200 for women over 50 and men over 70. So how much are people actually consuming? Well, looking at these 6 studies that provided calcium, average calcium intakes, we're looking at close to 900 milligrams a day in Western countries for vegans, over 1,000 or 1,068 for lacto-vegetarians, and about the same for omnivores. So vegans definitely having slightly lower intakes, but intakes that are actually higher than a lot of people might imagine them to be. Intakes in toddlers and youth in the veggie were actually pretty dismal. Omnivores just over the 400, lacto-ovo around the 400, vegans closer to 300. This is definitely lower than what most experts would recommend. So how do vegans and vegetarian people do in terms of their bone health? Well, the EPIC Oxford study was a little concerning. There have been a lot of studies that have reported somewhat reduced bone density and increased fracture rates among vegans compared to omnivores. But the 2020 study, the EPIC Oxford study, looked at about 55,000 individuals, and they found that the risk for total fractures was almost 1.5 times increased, and in vegans compared to omnivores. And this means about 20 more hip fractures for every 1,000 people over 10 years for vegans. The higher risk, however, was only observed in vegans with a BMI under 22.5. So vegans who had more, sort of muscle mass and body weight had lower risk, or no greater risk than omnivores. The increased risk was actually mainly for postmenopausal women. It wasn't so much for men. So why did we see increased risk? Well, vegans have lower body mass index. So the vegans are thinner. They have a BMI averaging 22.1 compared to 24.5 for the omnivores. They had lower, in this study, they had lower calcium intakes, 591 milligrams versus over 1,000 for the omnivores. They didn't look at vitamin D, but other EPIC Oxford studies show significantly lower intakes of vitamin D. They had lower protein intakes, about 13.3% of calories versus 17 for the omnivores. And they used a lot less hormone replacement therapy, which actually can increase bone density. So their There are a number of reasons why they may have had higher risk, but I can tell you from personal experience. This is, I'm 64 years old. I have a family history of osteoporosis. I had my bone density done after 20 years vegan. So I was about 50 years of age when I had it done. And I haven't had it done since, but I should get it done again. But my lumbar spine bone mineral density was 2.5 standard deviations above the young adult mean. My bone mineral density of my right femur was 2 standard deviations above the young adult mean. And just so you know, osteopenia is 1 to 2.5 standard deviations below the young adult mean, and osteoporosis is greater than 2.5 standard deviations below the young adult mean. When I went in to get my results from my doctor, his jaw, he opened my file and his jaw dropped. He said, your bone density is so high that we had to put an arrow at the top of the chart because we couldn't plot it. He said, I don't know what you're doing, but just keep doing it. He had ordered my bone mineral density because he was concerned because I had been vegan for many years. And I was a slim white female with a family history of osteoporosis. So, and I can tell you, I'm quite sure why I have strong bones. It's because I eat a very good diet. I make sure I get enough calcium and vitamin D and other nutrients that go towards building strong bones. But I'm physically active, and that's the key. When you're physically active, you're telling your body to stay, your bones to stay strong. So, and yes, that's me doing the handstand there. Strong vegan bones are really about meeting the RDAs for calcium, ensuring reliable sources of vitamin D, which help with calcium absorption, including some calcium vitamin D fortified foods if we can't get there. Eating a lot of vegetables and fruits, at least 9 servings a day, designing the diet to ensure optimal intakes of other bone building nutrients, like potassium and magnesium and vitamin K and all of those things. And we want to get weight-bearing exercise. And I aim for at least 60 minutes, 6 or 7 times a week, actually 7 times a week generally. So that's, what we should be doing when we live in a fairly sedentary society. I sit at a desk a lot of the time. I need to fit exercise in. It's just so important. So how do we get enough calcium without dairy? Well, we want to eat sufficient calcium-rich plant foods like low oxalate greens, tofu made with calcium, chia seeds, almonds, figs, beans like black beans and great northern beans. And we can use a little bit of tahini, blackstrap molasses, things like that. The big question, I can remember back in the 90s when the dairy industry in Canada claimed that they had an ad in magazines that said, sure, you can get calcium from plant foods, but it's not bioavailable. And that, of course, is not true. We absorb from dairy products about 34%, some, 32 to 34% of the calcium that's in that food. We absorb about the same amount of calcium from tofu made with calcium and from soy milk, possibly a little bit less from soy milk in the 25 to 32% range. We absorb a little bit less from most legumes, just over the 20%, and sweet potatoes. But we absorb actually significantly more from low oxalate greens, somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 70% from broccoli and kale and Chinese greens and turnip greens and mustard greens. These foods are also our sources of vitamin K and potassium, all sorts of nutrients that move us towards building stronger bones. So they're an exceptional source of calcium. However, we don't get as much calcium from greens that are high in oxalate, even though looking in a chart of calcium content of food, they look like they're really high up. But because they're so high in oxalates, the oxalates bind to calcium, making it unavailable for absorption. We only get about 5% of the calcium from spinach, beet greens, and Swiss chard, and from rhubarb as well. The other thing, number 2, that we can do is to select calcium-fortified non-dairy milks and other foods with added calcium if we have a hard time getting to where we need to be. Calcium fortified milks provide about 300 to 450 milligrams of calcium per cup. Tofu made with calcium provides about 100 to 300 milligrams per half cup. You just need to read the label. 1 to 2 servings of non-dairy milk, along with other calcium-rich plant food choices, will typically get us easily to the RDA, whether you're an adult or a child. We want to be aware of factors that inhibit calcium absorption. The things that have a negative impact are excessive oxalates or phytates, excessive sodium, a high acid load, alcohol, and caffeine. Positive impact, of course, vitamin D and fruits and vegetables as well. Other factors affecting calcium absorption are the amount of calcium consumed. So absorption efficiency decreases as calcium consumption at a meal increases. So if you eat your entire 1,000 milligrams of calcium at one meal, you'll absorb far less than if you distribute that 1,000 milligrams over 3 meals, for example. Age and life stage matter too. Calcium absorption is as high as 60% in infants and young children. Absorption decreases to 15 to 20% during adulthood, except during pregnancy when it goes up again.